Chairperson. So I would like to extend the affirmative case in two ways. So first I would like to explore the impact of sympathy, which is the main case coming from the previous speaker. Because what we heard from her was that unless we show the reality of the immigrants that they're living in poor conditions and excluded from their community and society, we cannot facilitate a social sympathy towards them, and we won't be able to harness and facilitate supports to the immigrant community. Three important responses to this point. And number one, we think that people already know that immigrants who cross the U.S.-Mexican border are living in very poor conditions and have hard time integrating in society. It is not a shocking new fact to say that even African American communities are also having difficult times when it comes to financial, and there's a lot of problem of poverty and those kind of things. So as a consequence of Fox media such as mainstream media such as Fox and CNN broadcasting these issues for decades, there's no need to additionally saturate this particular information, because people already know and people are already tired of this particular information and not changing. But second of all, we think that advocating sympathy by highlighting the vulnerability of an immigrant community is extremely unhealthy and counterproductive. Because when MSNBC broadcasts and portrays the vulnerable immigrant community living in U.S.-Mexican border, yes, that might create sympathy towards certain groups in our community, but at the same time it also creates a feeling of antipathy against it amongst, for example, communities like the poor white community, who also have sympathy and anger against the current status quo. What they're going to feel is that the government or mainstream media is only focusing on the immigrant problem, and they're trying to take all our jobs, and they're trying to take all our social supports, and that is what facilitates anger and antipathy between these two kind of communities. So what you create is a very unhealthy competition of vulnerability, and it creates backlash. But the third response here is that we believe that, in general, negative news is not an effective tool to advocate for certain social change, because negative news gets easily forgotten. And the reason why that is the case is because there's a lot of negative news, right? When you watch Fox, or when you watch CNN, all you see is the news of murder and rape and war, and we have Trump as our president. So even if you feel temporary sympathy towards these immigrants community, now the next news is going to be about murder happening in the next in your community, or war happening in some other third world country. So the feeling of sympathy necessarily gets diluted as a consequence of saturated information, of negative information. So we believe that in those kind of particular contexts of media, we think that it is a unique strategy for these progressive media to take to actually highlight and push for positive news, and within that saturated context, we think that necessarily gets a lot of uniqueness and attention, and as a consequence of it, it remains in the minds of the people, and ultimately we think that's very effective. So moving on to my next issue, which is the media portrayal of the status quo. So right now in the status quo, we think that conservative media, for example, Fox News, portray immigrants as very poor and vulnerable, and they're these conservative news necessarily extrapolate this fact and conclude to a message which says that Mexican youth are drug dealers, that immigrants from the Middle East are potential homegrown terrorists, immigrants in general are a burden to the society. So it's very important for us, the progressive media, to necessarily portray a counter-narrative against this, because that is not the only fact, obviously, which characterizes immigrant community. Now, they might say that conservative people only watch Fox, and they won't change just because progressive media necessarily shows this. Now, obviously, the target of today's debate is not hardline conservative people. Obviously, the target of today's debate is not also, those extremely leftist progressive people as well, because those people are already in support of our thoughts. The target of today's debate are people who are in the middle, who probably watch Fox on Monday and watch CNN on Tuesday and maybe sometime read Huffington Post. Those are the kind of people who do not have a fixed, strong ideology, and necessarily digest a lot of media types, right? Those are the kind of people who necessarily characterize the current youth generation, and those are the kind of people who we want to show a counter narrative and to show that immigrant community is not just about vulnerability and not poor. Now we think that mainstream media already broadcast and the response, sure.
So even if you say that sympathy will be diluted news become mainstream? Why won't it too be diluted?
We don't think that we don't think that our positive news itself, I think it's unrealistic to assume that our positive news will become the dominant narrative in the media, obviously, but we believe that our media news will be an extremely unique and highlighted news which will be remembered. So it's not just about the quantity, it's also about the quality of the news which makes people remember about that news. So the response coming from the previous speaker was to say that mainstream media already broadcast about successful immigrant athletes, so that's okay. But at the same time, the mainstream media does not focus and does not broadcast enough on things such as small business small business owners in the immigrant community who had a hard time starting up but became very successful in their particular community and now has become very rich. We don't see a lot of immigrants who became successful in places such as academia or politics at the same time. We want to show and highlight more of those kind of things, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, their response was to say that media should necessarily be representative of the vulnerable. Media have a responsibility to highlight the voice of the vulnerable. That's true, but at the same time, the role of the media is also not to show what is just factually correct, but it is also to highlight important key issues in our society, which is oftentimes covered up in our social discourse, in order to shift the societal discourse and shift the society into a certain way. The ultimate way in which we want to shift the society is to portray it. We want the majority of the society to perceive people from immigrant background as legitimate, not second-class or third-class citizens in our society, but as same as ourselves and legitimate economical contributor. And we believe that in order to do that, we need to portray a positive view of these immigrants, and that is why we are extremely proud.